Welcome back, capital F football fans, to the O&O Sports YouTube channel. Today, we are back with our 5th season preview. Thank you for the support on the season preview so far, by the way, by far our most popular series. Last week it was Tennessee, and this week you voted on it. It is the Oklahoma Sooners. Now, if you want to directly participate in the uploads you see on this channel, be sure to go to the community tab and vote on next week's season preview. Last week you did vote, and this week we have the Oklahoma Sooners. So to get started with the Sooners, we're going to go over a 2023 recap. What went wrong and what went right? Well, we're going to start with the wrong. For one, the pass defense was not amazing. In 2023, they were 100th in pass yards allowed per game, 39th in pass yards allowed per attempt, 74th in pass yards allowed per completion, and that was partially due to the next subject for what went wrong, pass rush. 91st in sacks per game. So they just did not get to the quarterback, resulted in a lot of plays over the air. It's hard to stop guys like Quinn Ewers, who are going to be able to dice up that defense if you can't get pressure. And that's partially what made that pass defense so mediocre in 2023. But to be fair, the Big 12 did have a lot of good quarterbacks that they did face in 2023. So just need to keep that in mind. And penalties were also a big issue for Oklahoma in 2023. We have to keep in mind that this is still a very young team. Brent Venables is going into his 3rd year. Last year was his 2nd year. So there's still going to be a lot of growing pains. Still going to have some issues like the penalties were for them last year. 105th in penalties per game and 99th in penalty yards per game. Not great, but like we said, still growing, still developing as a team. So you're going to see stats like that just don't really give you a lot of hope necessarily. But for what it's worth, Brent Venables and Oklahoma had a great season last year. There's a lot to build on that they started with last year, and they won 10 games. So it's very hard to be super critical of that season, but there are still areas that they need to improve upon, like the penalty department and discipline in general. And that's what went wrong for Oklahoma. What went right in 2023? Well, inversely, the pass offense was amazing, mostly due to the fact that they had an arguable top 5 quarterback in the country last year. 5th in pass yards per game, 8th in pass yards per attempt, 20th in pass yards per completion, and 30th in QB sacks. Now, 30th for sacks isn't amazing, but paired with all those other stats, can't really be mad at it. 30th isn't bad either. It's relatively good, pretty above average to good. And while they were able to protect the quarterback, Dillon Gabriel was able to do a lot with the football. Very great quarterback. He transfers out, unfortunately, but last year, very, very good. Was able to spread the ball out, and he's a big reason why Oklahoma was so successful in 2023. And second, they were really good on 3rd down in general as a team. They were 8th in 3rd down conversion percentage and 14th in opponent 3rd down conversion percentage. So altogether, very solid team on 3rd down. Was able to extend drives and was able to keep their opponents from extending drives, which is very valuable. And like I just said, the next thing that went right for Oklahoma was extending those drives. We talked about that 3rd down offense. They were also 14th in 4th down conversion percentage and 11th in punts per play. They didn't have to punt very often. They were 6th in punts per score, meaning they averaged 2 scores per 1 point. Cannot be mad at that. That is a very great place to be, 6th in the country. Very good at extending drives, and because they were able to extend those drives, it helped out a lot when they got into the red zone, which is our next point. They were very good in the red zone, 26th in red zone scoring percentage, 46th in opponent red zone scoring percentage. Now that first number, the offense is pretty good. Top 25 in red zone scoring percentage is very, very admirable. 46 doesn't sound as good, but when you can be above average to good in both of those categories, it typically means you're doing something right. And thus, Oklahoma was a very good red zone team in 2023. And that led to them being very, very dominant at home. Undefeated at home last year in Norman. Just got to tip the cap to Brent Venables and that staff for instilling that team with the confidence they needed. The year prior, remember, they went 5-7. Not a very good home team. This year, flipped that around, undefeated at home. And those are the credentials you like to see for a guy like Venables, who is young in his head coaching career, being able to grab that home field advantage and have their team be very successful in those home games. And the next step is just be successful in road games, which is a lot harder. But for what it's worth, they weren't bad last season. And that was 2023. What about 2024? For these schedules, they're going to face their first 4 opponents at home. It's Temple, then Houston, then Tulane, and then Tennessee. And then they go on the road to Auburn, followed by a bye week, then at a neutral site versus Texas in the Red River rivalry. Then at home versus South Carolina, on the road versus Ole Miss, at home versus Maine, on the road versus Missouri, and then another bye week, at home versus Alabama, and then on the road versus LSU. Now, that is a very, very tough schedule, especially due to the potential shift in play style and philosophy that they might have to bring on when they move to the SEC. Now, say what you will, call it SEC bias. The SEC is going to be a lot tougher than the Big 12, especially for a team like Oklahoma, who, like we said, is still young, still developing as a program. Going to be interesting if they can find their fit as early as year 1 in the SEC. For Texas, it's much more likely. They are a much more talented roster. They also jumped to the SEC from the Big 12. For Oklahoma, they're going to have to be much more gritty. They're going to have to claw for that spot rather than just being kind of put in that position like Texas is being put into it this season. And it is a higher likelihood to see potential disaster for Oklahoma than potential overachieving from that flip from a decently lenient 2023 schedule to a very, very difficult 2024 schedule. Going to be a hard road ahead for Oklahoma this season, but what are their strengths? For one, the wide receiver room is very deep. It's topped by Nick Anderson and recent Purdue transfer Deion Burks. Those two alone combined for more than 1,400 yards and 17 touchdowns in 2023. They're 2 great red zone threats, which should prove to be favorable for new quarterback Jackson Arnold. And what's interesting about previewing a team like Tennessee last week and then going to Oklahoma this week is they are very similar in the fact that they both have young quarterbacks, both massively talented, very coveted prospects coming in to college. Now it's their time to shine, and we think Jackson Arnold definitely can. Gonna have to wait and see, obviously, like Iamaleava at Tennessee, to see just how good they can be in their first year as a starter. Arnold is projected to be very good, maybe not as good as Iamaleava, but good nonetheless. And talking about him, another strength for Oklahoma is that quarterback depth. Now, Jackson Arnold, of course, is really good, very talented prospect. Going to see his first season as a starter. He has a very tough road ahead of him. He was up and down in the ball game, not super promising, did throw a number of interceptions, made a few bad decisions, but he's going to get an offseason of development, an offseason to really learn that playbook a little bit more. But if he does struggle, or in the case he gets injured, God forbid, they have probably the best backup quarterback in the country in Casey Thompson. He's a real journeyman. He battled injury in 2023 at FAU before going out completely. Before that, he didn't look great. But in his only 2 full seasons at Texas and at Nebraska, he went 63% with 4,500 total yards, 41 touchdowns, and 19 interceptions with a 152 passer rating. So when he's healthy, he's a very, very solid quarterback. And it's pretty unlikely that Arnold struggles to the degree where Casey Thompson has to come in. But in the circumstance where Thompson does have to fill in for Arnold, you're going to have probably the most capable backup in the country, like we just said. He can go out and be a leader for an offense like he did at both Texas and Nebraska. And what more do you want from a backup? I mean, it was very surprising to see him go to Oklahoma. Maybe a bit of a battle before the season. Really hard to believe just due to the fact that Jackson Arnold is massively talented. But if Thompson stays, I mean, he's a grad transfer. Hard to imagine he would transfer once again. But if he stays in that room, he will not only be a great depth piece, but a great teacher for Arnold. Just due to the fact that he is very experienced. He's a journeyman. Like we said, he's been everywhere pretty much, all across the country. And the next strength for Oklahoma is going to be depth on defense. 15 of the 22 at the first and second levels of that depth chart on defense are juniors and seniors. They have a lot of experience in the program, and while good experience doesn't necessarily lead to more success, it is generally a good thing to have guys that know the system, know the program, know the coaches, know the playbook in there, and they're going to have a lot of depth, a lot of experienced depth rather, on that defense, in that front, in the secondary, which could end up leading directly to more success on the field. And you might have noticed we did skip over the linebacker room, and that's because we wanted to focus on them as another strength. They return both of their tackle leaders from 2023 in Kip Lewis and Danny Stutzman. They're going to be two of the best linebackers in the SEC. They were two of the best linebackers in the Big 12, and they could end up being the best linebacker duo in the country, let alone the SEC. We'll have to wait and see on just how good they can be, but Stutzman, probably a top 10 defender in the country. Kip Lewis right there behind him, his sidekick, but just as good, just as talented as Stutzman is. And that secondary is also very good, very deep. They returned several starters, all of which produced to a meaningful extent in 2023. They have great returning production. I think I just said that, but really can't say it enough, honestly. Really solid depth at that unit. They were pretty good in 2023, and with that much returning production, it's hard to imagine they could get any worse for this upcoming season. And those were their strengths. What about weaknesses for Oklahoma in 2024? Well, for one, the running back room is not great. They were an above average unit, not necessarily a run heavy team in 2023, but they keep their leading rusher in Gavin Sawchuk, but they lose most of their other production. And they have the potential to be as good or better than they were in 2023, but they lack a true explosive RB1 type bell cow guy there at running back. And especially jumping to the SEC, they're gonna have to be a better unit all around. Lacks the necessary depth to really have a promising unit as far as going by committee, but overall they will have to be a lot better if they want to take pressure off Jackson Arnold, which is the main focal point for Oklahoma in 2024. Keep pressure off Arnold, keep him safe, give him options so that he can work. And for another weakness, the offensive line is a bit shaky this upcoming season. Their interior was completely overhauled in 2024, this offseason, which could cause issues in the run game. A lot of these guys are coming from the group of 5, so they're not going to have a lot of power 4 level experience, which is a bit concerning. I mean, talent is talent, but you usually want to have guys that have been in the system for a good year or two at least, starting for your program, and they're going to have 3 guys who come from different schools, really a band-aid on a bullet hole type situation. And the depth is also very scary. For their top 10 linemen on the depth chart are sophomores and freshmen. Not what you want to see. You want to see more developed guys if you can, obviously. Sophomores and freshmen can be great offensive linemen, definitely a possibility, but generally you want more experience there, especially on the interior. And they lose their best piece on the exterior in Caden Green. He was one of the best offensive linemen coming out of high school. He transfers out to Missouri. Just not a great offseason for that offensive line. And likewise, that defensive line is also a bit underwhelming. Not a huge weakness. I struggle to call this even a weakness in general. They have decent depth, just not a ton of meaningful experience returning. Not a lot of starters returning. And they could be in for a rude awakening in the SEC. That unit has good size, but could potentially get bullied by SEC offensive lines. Again, here's my SEC bias coming out, but those offensive lines are going to be very, very solid. Teams like Alabama, LSU, and Missouri are going to have very, very good offensive lines. And unless that defensive line takes a big step forward, they just don't match up very well as of July 9th, 2024. And another weakness is going to be those penalties. Now, penalties were an issue, always fixable. One offseason is very hard to gauge. Could still be an issue heading into the season. They were a big issue in 2023, like we said earlier. And if you want to give yourself the easiest transition into the SEC as possible, they need to be disciplined. Can't be 100th or 99th in penalties or penalty yards. But with a band-aid offensive line, it's going to be very difficult. We'll see how quickly they gel, or if they're able to gel at all. It's hard to imagine they won't gel. It's just going to take a few games. Gonna need to see the field. Practice is one thing, but more often than not, when you have a bunch of transfers on the offensive line, they really don't know what each other's doing. They don't trust each other, which makes it harder for the offense altogether to move the ball. And that was an overview. Let's get into our 2024 predictions. But first, as always, let's get into a few keys to success for Oklahoma in 2024. And their first key to success is going to be establishing the run. In the SEC, it'll be very difficult to have the type of prolific pass offense that they had in the Big 12 last year, especially without Dillon Gabriel. Of course, Jackson Arnold, like we said, is massively talented, has Dillon Gabriel type upside. It's just, will he have that this year? We don't know. But if you can establish a good run offense, you give Jackson Arnold a better chance to bloom into a star as soon as this season and allow yourself to grow and experiment on offense. And Texas as well is probably going to have to do that. There are two teams that could kind of move the ball at will at times in the Big 12 last season. Not going to be afforded that kind of offensive behavior in 2024 in the SEC. So that is why establishing the run is very important for both of those teams and for Oklahoma specifically. And for their next key to success, it's a no-brainer. You're going to have to limit the penalties like we talked about. You can't afford to shoot yourself in the foot in the SEC. You can against teams like Cincinnati and BYU, but definitely not against teams like Missouri, Tennessee, and LSU. And for the third key to success, they're going to need to lean on their back seven. Now, this might sound a little bit contradictory to some of the points we've talked about earlier in this video, but the defensive line probably isn't going to be bad. Definitely not their strongest suit. Their linebackers and defensive backs are definitely the strength on that side of the ball. They're going to be able to plug gaps and limit big plays over the air. If you trust them, if you lean on them to kind of just be able to contain those SEC offenses. And one of the biggest things in the SEC is being able to stop those rushing attacks. Teams like Alabama, especially Tennessee, definitely Missouri, they're going to have good rush offenses. And if you can limit the pass attacks to kind of focus in on those rushing plays, you're going to be able to stop the rushing attack more often than if you're just trying to get pressure every play. So it'll be big for them if they can kind of nullify SEC pass offenses. Once again, a very, very hard ask, but the linebackers going to be able to plug those gaps, like we said, and the secondary going to be able to lock down some of those SEC wide receivers. And if you can take away the pass, you can take away the run. And those are the keys to success. Let's get into the final grades for Oklahoma. The offense is going to come out to an 88.5. And while the skill positions are pretty good, the offensive line is very inexperienced at the Power 4 level. And they were kind of just thrown together through the transfer portal this offseason. It's very difficult to make that work in their first year in the SEC. Going to be interesting nonetheless. They could just come out and work very well together. You never really know. And like we said earlier, Jackson Arnold is going to be the biggest piece in that offensive puzzle. If he can come out and be a Heisman contender, obviously they're going to be really good. But if he can come out and just be very solid, it will lend more favorably to them. And adversely, if he comes out and struggles in his first couple weeks, going to be tough to get into that win column more often than not. But what should help them out is that defense, which comes into a 93.5. Very good all around. The linebackers and the secondary could potentially be elite units, which will take a lot of pressure off that defensive line, like we said, which hopefully for Oklahoma will allow them to get more pressure on quarterbacks this year than they did last year. And as for special teams, we didn't really talk about it at all so far in this video. They're going to come into an 85.5. Pretty decent, not amazing. Punter Luke Elzinga is fine. I think I pronounced that right. Elzinga? Whatever it is, he's fine, not necessarily amazing, but a pretty decent punter. And they're bringing in a new place kicker, Tyler Keltner, who has kicked one extra point in his FBS career, very inexperienced. He was decent at East Tennessee State, an FCS school, but that doesn't always transfer to the FBS, much less the Power 4 level. So it's very hard to gauge this far. That's why we're being more on the lower side. Could come in and just be a 78 to 85% kicker and be fine. Make all of his extra points and you don't really talk about it much. But we just don't know yet, so that's why they're coming in on the lower side for special teams. And as for coaching, they're going to come in at an 87.0. This might seem low, but it's just because Venables is still in the early stages of his head coaching career. So far, he's looked pretty good, which is why they are a high B. It's just going to take a little bit more for us to consider him an A- to A+ range guy. But for what it's worth, he seems like the right guy at Oklahoma. They've taken big steps forward already in his coaching tenure there. Obviously, they had a really good second year under Venables in 2023. And another thing for Oklahoma is going to be the fact that they do have to replace offensive coordinator Jeff Lebby, who left to take the Mississippi State job this offseason. He's been one of the best offensive coordinators in the country the past few years, was at Ole Miss, and then at Oklahoma the past 2 years under Venable. But they bring in Seth Littrell. Kind of hard to gauge how good Littrell can be as a coordinator. He was an analyst last year. He was the head coach at North Texas for a few years, had a few solid years there, but offensively definitely hasn't looked on the level of Lebby, but we will have to see there. He's been an offensive coordinator for a very long time, so he is experienced. Just not quite sure if that offense is going to be as good as a Jeff Lebby offense has been the past few years. And that is coaching. Onto the strength of schedule, they're going to come in at a high 97.0, one of the more difficult schedules in the country. Just to put it simple, that Final Five stretch is one of the worst, just behind Florida, who we did do a few weeks ago. 3 of their last 5 games are going to be against potential top 10 teams, and all 3 of those games are going to be on the road. So very, very difficult stretch to end that season for Oklahoma. Very difficult schedule all around. We didn't really talk about Tulane. Tulane is a great team. They lost Willie Fritz, but they bring in John Sumrall, who was the head coach at Troy before taking the job at Tulane this season. Not sure how good that Tulane team is going to be. They do retain a lot of talent from that team last year, surprisingly. And they play Willie Fritz's new team in an out-of-conference game against Houston. 2 very under-the-radar matchups, especially Tulane. Tulane has been very good. They upset USC a few years ago. They were very good once again last year or so. Even their non-con isn't going to be easy, and that is why their strength of schedule is so high. And overall, that's going to round them out to a 90.3, an A-. Pretty good all-around team. Hard to say definitively how good that offense is going to be when we don't exactly know how good Jackson Arnold will be this season. Their biggest issues are the lines, especially the offensive line, and that is never a good sign. Don't want to be too doom and gloom. They should still be decent lines. It's just a big concern and not what you want to see, especially going into the SEC. And like we said previously about Arnold, like Iamaleava of Tennessee, his inexperience is going to be the biggest factor of how good the Oklahoma Sooners will be in 2024. If he can play up to the potential that the old Boomer Sooner fans think he will, they should be in for a pretty good season, and if he struggles, could be the difference between a game or two. And that brings us to our final prediction. The ceiling for Oklahoma is going to be 10-2 with a 6-2 conference record. Now this is going to be very, very difficult. It would require Oklahoma to beat at least one of Ole Miss, Missouri, or LSU on the road, as well as Tennessee, Alabama, and Texas at home or at a neutral site. Those 6 games are going to be brutal. And if they want to reach that ceiling, they're going to have to beat a number of those teams. Not super likely, but not that out of the picture considering how good Arnold is and how good that defense overall is. But that brings us to the floor. The floor is going to be 5-7. There is a big gap here at Oklahoma just due to the fact that that jump to the SEC could prove to be no problem at all or a ginormous problem. Like we said, 5-7 with a 2-6 conference record. This is also pretty unlikely. It would mean that they lose their 6 hardest games as well as an extra game to an Auburn, South Carolina, or Tulane, who, like we said, should be really good again, to be fair. And for our final prediction, we're going to have Oklahoma at 7-5 with a 3-5 conference record. If you're an Oklahoma fan, probably not what you want to see, but for what it's worth, for the difficulty of that schedule and for the inexperience on that offensive line and at quarterback, it still should be a very good season for Oklahoma. Nothing to be ashamed of. Obviously, you want to get back to that 10-win mark again immediately, but some things just don't work out that way, and that's what we're predicting this season. And while this still feels unlikely just due to the fact that Oklahoma is massively talented, and the work that Venables has done so far with the roster as well as his coaching staff and philosophy, it's hard for me to give them much leeway in terms of confidence levels in most of those SEC matchups. But for what it's worth, Venables' Oklahoma is much more balanced than we saw Riley's just a few years ago. Hard to compare. Those Oklahoma teams under Lincoln Riley did make the playoffs, but Venables is taking a more balanced approach. He's not cutting any corners. He wants this team to be a dominant SEC power, and for what it's worth, what we're projecting it very well could be. He's building up that defense, building up that offense, bringing in a lot of talent, but, and I'm not overstating this, taking Oklahoma to the SEC will probably be the biggest challenge that Venables will face in his entire career. That is how big of a jump this is going to be, and they're probably going to feel it in 2024. It is a very different ball game than the Big 12. And that is why we have them at 7-5 in 2024. And that is going to do it for this episode of our season previews. Once again, if you want to vote on next week's season preview, be sure to go to the community tab. It should be uploaded by the time you're watching this video. Go vote on the next team and be sure to like and subscribe. It helps us out a lot. If you enjoy the uploads and want to see more, be sure to click on the channel, subscribe, and check out some of our other playlists. And as always, if you agree or if you disagree with some of the things we said in this video, feel free to drop a comment saying what you agree with and what you disagree with. Let us know what you think. And with that, we will see you in the next video.